Hello, everyone, and welcome to what is episode 4 of the NewsWhip Pulse. As regular attendees of this webinar will know, my name is not Paul Quigley. You might be used to seeing me on the other side of these questions from Paul. My name is Benedict Nicholson. I am the head of research and editorial here at NewsWhip, and I am happy to be joined today by Neal Rothschild, who is the Director of Audience and Growth at Axios. Welcome to the Pulse, Neal.
Thank you, Ben. Great to be here, and also very excited to be in a collared shirt for the first time in about 8 months.
Yeah. There's a mild dress code on the Pulse. It's not a serious dress code, but thank you for adhering to it. I do appreciate
like
that.
I'm being back to a serious person, which I have not for a long time. So.
Yeah, precisely. Very good. So just a note for anyone who hasn't attended one of these webinars before. We do like to keep them brief, so we will probably talk for about 20 minutes or so. That's very much our motto of speed to insight, and Axios' motto too, actually, of smart brevity, right? So hopefully we can do that. So we'll talk for about 20 minutes about the NewsWhip-Axios election tracker, and also about the election more broadly, which Neal is deep into covering. And then we will take questions at around 10 to for 5 minutes, and then we'll wrap up depending how long the questions go. So thank you very much for joining us. And Neal, why don't we just start by kind of talking a bit about the ideas behind the election tracker, and once we've done that, I will share my screen, and we can talk about exactly what that looked like at various points over the coverage. So why don't you start by saying where this idea kind of came from and how it came about?
Sure. So I work on Axios' audience team, which means that we are constantly posting to social media. And the fun thing about that is that you can get really interesting data and insights about what topics readers really get worked up and excited about and care about. And it really varies for whether it's Kellyanne Conway or it's Chuck Schumer or it's AOC. So you can really see, either by the person or by the storyline, like how much it's animating people. And I thought, this is really fascinating information to know, but obviously just Axios's alone doesn't tell you a whole lot about what's going on. But if you could open that up and kind of see across the universe of social media, like what are the storylines and the people and kind of the headlines that really make people react strongly, that make them care, that make them defend their honor or attack people that they don't like. So what we were hoping to do is to bring just America a way to see this information, because it matters a lot. It's not, what you see on your own individual social media feed is just you, and it is not representative of what millions and millions of others see. So thankfully, NewsWhip has the technology that, we can look at that, we can understand that, and we can present that to readers to help them understand a dynamic that I think was really underappreciated in 2016 for kind of how much certain storylines fired up the Republican base, completely out of view for most people if you're kind of mainly consuming mainstream media.
Yeah, and just so people have context around that, this is what the first one of those looked like, and this was originally built around a couple of things: the Democratic primary race, and the issues that you and your team identified would be probably key issues in the election, right? So this was our very first one, which I think was June 2019, I believe. Yeah, July 2nd, 2019. So here you can see pretty much, and it's interesting, to Neal's point, is that exactly what you see is, Joe Biden was leading pretty much in terms of coverage from very early on, and the order of these folks behind them are pretty much the order in which they ended up dropping out from bottom to top, with a few exceptions of some people dropped out earlier than they maybe might have, and some people were in the race maybe longer than they maybe might have been. But Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, all very close to the top from July. As soon as Biden announced, basically, you see him shoot up the rankings there, from about 5th. Even before he announced, he was like 5th or 6th in terms of how much he was being written about and talked about, which obviously gives a bit of a first mover advantage, just because people were expecting him to run. But then it got more interesting, I think, when the field of candidates narrowed down a bit. And then you can see here that Joe Biden was, back and forth with Bernie Sanders until Super Tuesday, which is here. So I don't know if you want to talk a bit about that week, Neil.
Yeah, it just really felt like throughout the race, Biden held the gravitational center of the primary, and that to the extent that someone else, whether it was Bernie or whether it was Warren or whether Buttigieg or Kamala, to the extent that there was a possibility that they might overtake him, like that would have been a huge seismic shift in the race, because even though he wasn't, didn't have the boldest ideas, wasn't making the most controversy, wasn't, particularly like a lightning rod for the things he was saying, his ideas. It just felt like he was the gravitational center of the race. So that really to upend the status quo, would have been kind of a major moment in the race. And that did happen kind of in the beginning of the primary. So if you kind of look at this tracker and how Bernie and Biden shifted between 1 and 2, it was during kind of Iowa and then New Hampshire and then Nevada, kind of right before South Carolina when Biden pulled it out. It really started to look like Bernie was going to be the nominee. And to an extent that, the social media interactions really told that story. I think kind of Democratic base on social media started to get behind him and started to see him as the victor before South Carolina happened and things just suddenly turned back in Biden's direction.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because I mean, what we saw with some people here was, people were having good weeks. Like Cory Booker occasionally would be in the top 3, but he just couldn't maintain that consistency in terms of coverage. Whereas once Biden announced, he was basically never outside of the top 3 in terms of coverage. So just having that consistent level of coverage is so important for anything, really. I mean, you don't want to be in and out of the public eye, especially in a presidential race. You want to be very much in the public eye firmly, even if you're not the most in the public eye of the candidates.
It's worth pointing out, like, this wasn't fawning coverage of Joe Biden. I think I wrote 1-2 pieces about just how it was his gaffes that were getting the most coverage and the most social media interactions. Meanwhile, if you looked at kind of who was getting the most positive coverage, it's like NewsWhip sent us over kind of stories about Elizabeth Warren, which are getting most interactions. It was stuff like she has bold ideas, she is a welcome, like kind of the sentiment of the stories was that she's a revolutionary kind of in the positive sense. Kind of for those a bit more skeptical of going as far as Bernie, they saw her as like a strong force for the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. So it's not as though like, coverage begets favor in the eyes of voters. It was kind of critical coverage of Biden, but I think just the dynamics of the race were such that he kind of broadly felt like the guy, and that it would take a lot to kind of knock him down from that status.
Yeah, and I think, even if you're getting critical coverage, people care about you enough to write that critical coverage, I think is probably one of the points, and that's an interesting one. Just to move on a little then, I think this is an interesting point that you raised of basically, despite having a lot of coverage and engagement, Biden can't compete with Trump. And the time that he got closest to being able to compete with Trump was when he announced Kamala Harris as his running mate. So if you could speak to that a little and what you saw around that.
Yeah, so kind of the original premise of doing the attention tracker with NewsWhip was that if you compared Trump and Hillary's numbers, Trump's were higher than Hillary's during the 2016 cycle, and kind of the amount that the things that he would say and the ideas he was proposing was getting out there, was getting shared a lot. People were understanding, maybe even people that weren't traditional voters, and kind of this social media ecosystem kind of gave him this extra exposure that could have an important dynamic in the race. So then I was thinking kind of going into 2016 or going into 2020, we should look out for a similar dynamic. But kind of became clear, well, like no one's ever going to out Trump. No one's going to beat him in the media game. and it might be a little too simplistic to think of kind of all media and total social media interactions as a good thing, no matter what, just because we know that there's a ton of negative coverage and negative attention for Trump, almost in the way that what Biden, what he wanted to be in the race was the anti-Trump, the steady hand, the kind of more reliable person, the person to bring politics, kind of make it less of a show and make it less of a spectacle. So it became less about, in my mind, like you're trying to get interactions as you're trying to accomplish whatever it takes to win an election. And in this case, it's not being as much of a lightning rod as possible.
Sure. Yeah. So, but interesting that Kamala Harris really added a lot of enthusiasm to the Biden campaign by our numbers that we're looking at here. So they got within 2/3 of Trump's numbers, I think, for the first time since maybe March. But that's only because Trump had particularly low numbers that week, and I think that was Super Tuesday's Biden's Super Tuesday victory. So the announcement of Kamala Harris outperformed Biden's Super Tuesday victory in terms of engagement to media coverage. So people were really excited about that.
I think that's an important dynamic to look at because Biden, I don't think, does a lot to stir up the Democratic base of voters. I think kind of to the extent that he is popular and to the extent that he could win, it's because he is an anti-Trump. He's a known commodity. He's rather steady. He's unremarkable, but probably won't do anything that people find too distasteful. But that's kind of more of an anti-Trump sentiment than it is a pro-Biden sentiment. But I think what Kamala Harris brings to the ticket and kind of what the announcement that she would be the running mate meant, like Kamala Harris she represents a more kind of progressive vocal part of the Democratic Party, kind of a voice of social justice, a voice of change that was more part of her campaign, that it stands more for voting for something rather than against something, as might be the appeal for Biden. So it was interesting to see that dynamic play out.
Sure, yeah. And then I just wanted to quickly note before we move on from the tracker itself, I thought this was a really interesting piece that you did on the coronavirus, because we're not just tracking the presidential candidates, obviously, we're tracking the issues that matter to voters. And actually, we see that now on a week-to-week basis, the engagement that stories about coronavirus are receiving is less than 1/10 of what it was getting at its peak in March, which is just something interesting that you pointed out that I thought was worth sharing again. So yeah, I think that there are a number of ways that we can use this data to kind of reflect on what's capturing the public interest beyond just, polls and horse race data about who's winning in Ohio right now, who's winning in Florida right now, who's winning on a national level right now, but like what are the issues that people are actually engaging with? I think that's a really important point.
Right. It's really hard to put a finger on enthusiasm. Polls don't measure kind of the enthusiasm and how likely, you might be asked who you plan to vote for, but it doesn't say anything about how excited you are to vote or not vote, or whether you actually will or won't. So I think these stories kind of help to put a finger on like what's the degree of passion that people have about these stories and topics.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm going to move away from the attention tracker now and just talk a bit more broadly about the election for a few minutes. But I just want to invite people, if anyone has any questions about anything we've talked about so far or anything we do talk about, please do put them in the chat and we will get to them at the end. So you were definitely aware and covering the 2016 election, and now obviously at Axios you're covering the 2020 election. Do you see any differences in the way that the media are approaching it in any sense?
I think there's a lot more humility, kind of based on how, even if people weren't perhaps guaranteeing that Clinton would beat Trump, there was kind of a undercurrent of just more assuredness that Trump was a sideshow and that he wasn't to be taken seriously, and yeah, he might have gotten this far to become the nominee, but it would kind of stop there. I think there was a lot more trust that the data and the polling we had was predictive, I think what 2016 exposed was not the flaws of polling, but the flaws of swing state polling in particular, and how, yeah, you might have the national number down to within a few points, but if a few swing states turn the other way, well, that's the only thing that matters for who's going to become president. So I think there's people feel a bit snake bitten by having gotten it wrong there, that they just are a lot more on guard for the mistakes from last time. And I think kind of each election is almost an overcorrection from the previous election in some way, whether it's the media coverage or how the politicians themselves are framing things.
Yeah, definitely. And you know, this is a very unique election cycle, both because of that overcorrection that you're talking about, but also, you know, it's the first pandemic election cycle for, you know, 100 years at least. So what do you see as being the big challenges for media in this election cycle? Is it mostly to do with not being being a little more humble, as it were, or is it literally just access to candidates, just because there are fewer events and things like that, or is it something else that maybe we're not thinking about as non-journalists?
Well, I think just the dynamics of pandemic voting make the calculus for how the results are going to turn totally different. We used to look at like how many people are undecided, how many might turn to Trump or to Biden, like who's going to pick which side. You know, the data shows that there are just fewer undecideds this year. I mean, after 4 or 5 years of Trump in the public sphere, first of all, like how can you just not have an opinion on him? The polls show that just like from a Monmouth and a Quinnipiac poll in the last month or so, just maybe 2 or 3%, there's a chance that they might change their vote. So I think that the framing needs to turn to is, instead of like who's going to get your vote, is how can votes actually happen and how will they get counted. There's a you know, the simple act of voting suddenly becomes extremely not simple at all. Like I think we've seen the story in Pennsylvania where naked ballots, and if you're not putting the ballot in the right inner envelope, which goes in the outer envelope, could 100,000 votes. So I think these are the types of things that we need to be paying attention to and on guard for, like what is the voting process and how will votes get counted in this completely unprecedented election atmosphere.
Yeah, and how do you think the media, I guess, plays into that? Is it like a public service of making sure people know how their vote should, like that the Pennsylvania thing that you mentioned, are news organizations going to run almost PSAs of like, this is how you make sure your vote is counted? I guess maybe that happens on more of a local news level than a national news level. Yeah,
I do think it would be a responsible thing to do if you're if the point is to inform people of what's going on and what's going to happen. I mean, it's a public service on a personal level, but it's also kind of a heads up to this is going to be a thing that will happen if people don't understand the correct way to vote. So it's also like, you know, it goes beyond just here's how it can help you to here is something that could happen that could swing the election results if they're not properly understood. I think something else is just making sure that all news networks are properly priming people to not expect election or expect results on election night as they're used to. It could take days, it could take weeks. I think just setting the expectation that there's nothing wrong, there's nothing amiss with the system if it's taking longer than normal, which is, I don't think, something that we've come to be accustomed to.
Yeah, and I think a point on that as well is just thinking about, and I don't have the answer to this, is how you break through those filter bubbles, which often occur on social media. Of, you know, for example, in our election newsletter yesterday, we had an example where the Senate released a report about Biden and Ukraine and Hunter Biden, etc. And it was just covered completely differently in conservative media to how it was covered in, you know, even the New York Times. Like the New York Times headline was the Senate report finds no Biden wrongdoing, and then the Daily Wire found all these things that they put in their headline of, you know, these are all the things Hunter Biden's done that you should be aware of, that went out to their audience and got huge engagement. So as, you know, Axios is very, I would say, has the reputation of being very down the middle. Like, how do you, as a down the middle organization, work to get into I guess, both sides' filter bubbles or everybody's attention? Like, how do you approach that as someone who obviously works very closely with social media?
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard, and like I don't think we have the answer to it. That people want to see the news that makes them feel good, that reinforces their beliefs. I think like we've kind of been heading in this direction for a few decades now with the proliferation of cable news. So then all of a sudden you can watch the TV that suits your needs, and you can watch, or you can get filtered through social media what you want to read. But just kind of even a few of the items that you sent us from NewsWhip for kind of the stories that got the most traction with regards to violence in cities, which is a story recently, like the #1 story on that. Like, I think we kind of all broadly aware of the violence that has happened in cities, and looting and the protests in response to police violence. But just kind of, I think the #1 story was Chicago looters attacked Ronald McDonald House with 6 children inside, Charity said. Like, that was not a story that I was at all aware of. It's, not to diminish the significance of that, but it's certainly not the most important story going on. So it's just what the result is that stories get filtered based on their emotional appeal rather than their importance. And that's going to take a long time for kind of the whole media ecosystem to try to correct.
Yeah, and honestly, I don't necessarily think that's a social media thing. I think, that has been something that has been building for a while, and what makes it onto cable news is often very different to what's in the print newspapers and things like that. So as things go across mediums, I think you're right that, it gets filtered in different ways by different people. So that's very interesting, I think. I'm going to pause there and invite the audience to submit some questions. I don't know if we have any questions primed, Danielle, that people have submitted. That would be great. Danielle is doing the wonderful service of collating questions. So thank you very much for doing that. Let's see. I can ask another question, Neil, in the meantime while we wait. Okay, debates. Excellent. Good question. So the Trump versus Biden records, Supreme Court, COVID-19, economy, race and violence in cities, and integrity of the elections are all topics of the first debate. This is a good question for both of us, actually. Which of the topics for the first debate do you think will generate the largest response on social media?
Can you go through those topics?
I can absolutely go through them again. So this is the Chris Wallace moderated debate, I believe. So it's Trump versus Biden records, the Supreme Court vacancy, COVID-19, the economy, race and violence in cities, and the integrity of the election.
I think that Biden is going to have a lot of success going after Trump for the coronavirus and his response to it. For almost everything else, it seems like he has his scripted response that he'll go to time and again. For the economies, like, it was soaring to like record levels before the China virus came through. But I think there's just like kind of the coronavirus is just something that he's to an extent thrown his hands up over. That just his response to it is kind of varied at each turn. He's been test driving different responses, and ultimately that's kind of where his favorables have dropped the most on that topic. So I could definitely see that kind of being where Biden might be able to get him. What do you think on that? No,
it's a good question. So I think that might be the where Biden kind of can make inroads. I just don't know whether that's something that will be reflected in the coverage and the social media interaction. You can tune in next week to the Axios-NewsWhip media tracker to see what's actually right. I just think things like the integrity of the election are things that are massive social media topics right now, and I've seen so many stories about, especially in more conservative media, about mail-in voting, that people are just I think the Trump base is very fired up over that right now. But I think the Democrats are very fired up, as you say, over the handling of coronavirus and things like Trump saying that he can't guarantee a peaceful transfer of power after the election. That both bases are very fired up about different things. So I think it's we probably see different interactions, as we said, in different filter bubbles, different things will be highlighted.
There might be a little Venn diagram overlap
Yeah.
where each side has something to say about the issue.
Yeah, exactly. So one more question, and then I'll wrap up. Besides the presidential election, are there any candidates that have stood out to you in running for the House, State Senate, or State Assembly offices in terms of just the amount of attention that they have received on social media?
So we have, I think what's going to be most interesting is looking at these key Senate races. We don't have like an AOC type running for the House. But I think kind of in these key Senate races that could end up turning the balance of power either to the Democrats or staying with the GOP. One person I think gets a lot of attention is Jamie Harrison, who's challenging Lindsey Graham in South Carolina. I think a lot of that comes from like fury from the left towards Lindsey Graham and kind of thinking of him in the past as someone who's a more reasonable Republican who's kind of gotten totally Trumpified, and they see kind of Jamie Harrison as kind of he's a young Black politician who can represent like kind of the future, not just of South Carolina, but of the South, of kind of a presence who could kind of make make the South turn more democratic and more liberal in the future.
Yeah, I was actually going to say the exact same person. Jamie Harrison has received a huge amount of attention. I think Rolling Stone did a big profile of him that got a lot of attention. So Jamie Harrison for me is a big highlight on the amount of coverage for him that has been engaged on social media. All right, well, I think we'll wrap up there just because we're getting very close to time, and I'm conscious of our smart brevity. So I just want to say, Neal, if there are any newsletters that you think people should sign up for, that if you could tell people where those are, that would be great.
Always Axios AM from Mike Allen. If we have a new Axios-NewsWhip attention tracker item, you'll see it there. So Mike Allen's Axios AM. You can just go to signup.axios.com to find it there.
Brilliant. And I think Danielle's put the link in the chat there as well for people. And then I would encourage people to sign up for our election briefing, which goes out every day. We look at the top stories predicted every morning, the top stories of the last day, and then the top social posts. And then we do a spotlight as well. So you can sign up at newswhip.com/newsletter. Now is the time when I would normally plug our next episode's guest, but I'm actually not going to do that this time because it would give away some very exciting news that we have next week that's coming in the middle of next week. So be assured that we do have a very exciting surprise guest, but I'm not going to tell you who it is. But Paul will be back hosting, and watch out for the news next week that will include who our surprise guest for the webinar is going to be. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you once again, Neal, for coming on. It was a super interesting discussion. I love doing the Axios-NewsWhip election tracker. Let's keep doing it. It's great stuff. Watch out for it next week. And thanks everyone who attended. And we will see you in 2 weeks with our very special guest. Thank you. Goodbye.